Thank you again for coming out tonight. As Paul said, you are special, but he didn't mention the main reason why you're special, and that's because you made it here. You had to negotiate multiple changes of date, venue, as well as, will university be open? We were told it would be open at 5 o'clock. Does that mean the doors open at 5 o'clock? Would we all be sitting outside until 5? That wasn't even clear until a few hours ago. So I am so pleased that you're here. I'm also grateful for all the people who are listening online, because this is being broadcast online, and it is also being recorded, so you'll be able to share it with others who are not here in the future. Now, I do have to say that I am very sensitive to the fact that we're talking about climate change when it's snowing. This is a little animation from one of our global weirding videos. And it seems like, whenever you're going to be talking about global warming or climate change, there's an ice storm or there's a snowstorm or it's the coldest February on record. And here you are trying to tell people that, yes, the entire planet is warming over climate timescales. So why has it snowed? Well, there's 4 reasons why we see snow today, and I want to walk through them with you briefly. Reason number 1 is the following. Now, I know you may say, yes, we're not at December 21st yet, to which I will reply, well, winter is coming. I can't take the credit for this photoshopping. I stole it from someone else. Why is it that we get winter? We get winter because of, and this is another animation from our Global Weirding series, because of the tilt of the Earth's axis of rotation relative to the orbit. So the Earth orbits around the sun, and as our hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, that's winter, and that's why it's summer in Australia, because they're tilted towards, right? And then as we are tilted towards the sun, then we get summer. So even though the planet can be warming over climate timescales, we still get winter and summer because that's caused by the axis of rotation of the Earth. And climate change doesn't affect the axis of the rotation of the Earth. Well, not much. It actually does affect it a little bit. Because as the massive ice sheets are melting that anchor our poles, that is actually causing us to wobble slightly. Isn't that crazy? But not much, not enough to do away with winter. So we will always have winter. It will just be warmer than it was before eventually, but it will not go away. What's reason number 2 why we can have a cold winter? Reason number 2 is natural variability. From year to year, it can be colder or it can be warmer. Let me illustrate this. This is our average global temperature as measured by thousands of thermometers around the world. Doesn't look like it's going up, does it? Well, that's because over short periods of time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it can get cooler, it can stay the same, but then when you fill in the missing data here, and then let's just make it all the same color, you can see that yes, indeed, we are warming over climate timescales. Even though 1 or 2 years might be colder or warmer than the rest, decade by decade by decade, we're getting warmer. And in fact, if you look at the history of temperature over the last 2,000 years, over the course of human civilization, of Western civilization, I should say, you can see that there's lots of ups and downs. There was even, the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. But what is happening now is highly unusual. And the reason why we even have this data is because of Michael Mann, who's right here at Penn State. This data is from one of his papers, yep. Which was remarkable because it showed how significant the change is that we're seeing today compared to what we as humans have experienced over the course of our civilization. So why is it so cold outside? Number 1, it's winter. Number 2, you can have natural variability. But there's actually a 3rd reason, and that is climate change. Now you might say, okay, hang on a second here. Where are you going? Well, as air gets warmer, it holds more water vapor. It holds about 6 to 7% more water vapor per degree Celsius of warming. Also, evaporation speeds up. And so since the 1950s, we have seen a really big increase in heavy precipitation events. And where is the biggest increase that we've seen? In this region. 55% increase in the 1 in 100 wettest events. That's what the 99th percentile means, the 1 in 100 wettest. They've increased 55%. Now, I'm not using the word precipitation to be all fancy and sciencey. I'm using it because it is accurate, because precipitation falls as rain, but when it's below freezing, what does it fall as? Yes. So when we see heavy precipitation increasing, sometimes that can actually mean that we're seeing heavier snowfalls as well. And so the very fact that we've seen some of the heaviest snowfall events on the East Coast in recent years is entirely consistent with the fact that we're seeing the biggest increase in heavy precipitation over this region. Isn't that interesting? And then there's actually a fourth reason. What is this fourth reason? Well, the fourth reason is the most interesting one because it gets into the cutting edge science that we're just trying to figure out today. It's the fact that we have this thing called the jet stream, which is a band of high elevation, very fast winds that whip around the planet and essentially guide our weather systems around the planet. The jet stream is driven by the temperature difference between the cold air over the Arctic and the warmer air further south. The bigger the temperature difference between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes, the faster and the stronger the jet stream. But as the world warms, the Arctic is warming faster than the mid-latitudes. And this picture from the latest IPCC report shows a number of different impacts. We're also seeing greater forest fire area burn. We're seeing snow water equivalent going down. We're seeing sea level going up. It's showing a whole bunch of different changes. But what I want you to focus on is I want you to focus on the globe. Where is it warming the most? In the north. In fact, Alaska is warming twice as fast as the rest of the US. So what does that mean for the jet stream? It means that the temperature difference between the cold air mass and the warm air mass that drive the jet stream is going down. The temperature difference is going down because the Arctic is warming faster. So as a result, the jet stream is starting to meander and slow down like a river. Imagine a river flowing downhill. If it's flowing downhill really steeply, it goes straight downhill, right? But as a river gets to a plain, it meanders around. We're starting to see this happen. And again, some of the work done right here at Penn State has started to look at identifying the relationships between Arctic warming and the impact on planetary waves and how that is affecting our circulation. Other research, this research just came out earlier this year, specifically looked at how warming in the Arctic was linked with increased frequency of winter weather in the United States. And so ironically, this is really strange, I know, and that's why I do think that global weirding is a much better word for it than global warming. Ironically, the fact that the Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the world could affect the risk of extreme weather further south, not just in summer where we see extreme heat, but also in winter. Now, I did warn you, though, that this really is at the cutting edge of what we're looking at in atmospheric science today. And so in the latest U.S. National Climate Assessment, Part 1 on the science was released last November. I was one of the co-authors, not on this chapter, but on some other chapters. So in this chapter on the Arctic, they talked about that, and they said that atmospheric circulation patterns we know that they connect the Arctic with the rest of the U.S. We also know that mid-latitude circulations from down here affect Arctic temperatures, and we know too that the Arctic is warming faster, but we only have a couple of studies that have been published so far really linking the warming to weather patterns down here. And so it concludes the influence of Arctic changes over the coming decades. It remains an open question with the potential for significant impact. And that's why the two studies I just showed you are just very new studies that are starting to connect the dots. But it's interesting, isn't it? The Earth's climate system is really as complex as that of the human body. The way that different parts of the climate system are connected is incredible, and we're learning more about that every day. But in the meantime, though, next time you hear somebody say something like this, you now have an answer for them, right? This is by no means the only sciencey sounding argument we hear when it comes to climate change, though. I would say probably the most frequent objection that we hear is it's just a natural cycle. And I think, well, who do you think studies natural cycles? That's what we do. Or we haven't studied this long enough to be sure. Or, of course, scientists are just making this whole thing up to get the government grant money, of course. Sea levels aren't going up, they're going down. It's such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide. It's such a tiny amount of white powder I just put in your water. It's the sun. And then, of course, what about the dinosaurs? Yes, it was warmer back in dinosaur times. So when we hear all these sciencey sounding objections, we often think, well, if they just knew the facts, they'd change their minds, right? Surely, if we just tell them how old, how simple, and how clear the science is, people will change their minds. Well, let me actually ask you this. Here's our next poll, and this is going to be A, B, C, or D. How old do you think the fundamentals of climate science are? Are they 200 years old, 100 years old, 50 years old, or do you think it was invented by Al Gore? I will go over here to our poll. Usually this works in the slides. I've done this for 2 years. It's the first time it hasn't worked. Don't you hate that? But there's always a first time, right? Okay, so let's see. Shush, don't tell anybody the answer. Oh, wow, okay. So we've got, 100 years is catching up. Okay, 50 years is, keep at it. So 200 years is A, 100 years is B. Yeah, we got one D, all right. Excellent, somebody bet. Isn't this kind of fun how you can see the numbers change as you text in? Okay. We're going up and down a bit, all right. So you all are very knowledgeable. You are correct. The 57% is correct. And you've probably heard this before, right? You've probably heard people talk about the history of climate science. Back in the 1820s, Joseph Fourier went to Egypt with Napoleon. And while in Egypt, he started to reflect on the nature of heat, understandably. He started to reflect on the difference between wearing a dark black coat in Egypt versus wearing, a cool white robe. And he started to think about the energy balance of the planet and the fact that, according to the basic physics they knew back then, the planet should be a lot colder than it is right now. In fact, it should be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is today. And it isn't. And that's because our planet has an atmosphere. And then John Tyndall in the 1850s, a British scientist, discovered which specific gases were responsible for keeping the planet warmer than it would be otherwise. And he didn't just discover which gases, he actually connected them to coal mining. He realized that by mining, extracting, and burning coal, we were producing more of these gases than were naturally in the atmosphere. At the same time, on the other side of the ocean, Eunice Foote, who we do not have a photograph of, but her 7th grade niece and I are looking for one. We are going through Ancestry, contacting the relatives to see if we can find one. Eunice Foote was an amazing woman. She was an amateur scientist. She was a women's rights advocate. And she did experiments pretty much in her backyard. She wasn't a classically trained scientist, but she did experiments. In 1856, she did an experiment where she filled different glass jars with gases and put them out in the sun and measured how much the temperature increased in each jar. Now, her experiment was a bit flawed because she wasn't looking only at infrared or heat energy, and there was also the effect of the glass to cope with. But she wrote up her results. They were presented in 1856 at the annual meeting of the American Society for the Advancement of Science, which is a meeting that still goes on today. And at the end of her paper, she said this. She said, if carbon dioxide levels were higher on a given planet, then the temperature would be higher. She said that in 1856. Then in the 1890s, Arrhenius, who was a physical chemist who won a Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry, on the weekends he decided, for fun, I will calculate from first principles how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. It took him 2 years to finish his calculations by hand. It was essentially the first energy balanced climate model. After the first Christmas, his wife left him. And I take that very much to heart because I do a lot of coding and programming myself, but I set up the I set up everything to run, and then I go have dinner with my family, and then I go back and check it afterwards. But the numbers that he got were amazingly correct. Not only that, but he was able to calculate how much more the Arctic would warm than the rest of the planet. And then in the 1930s, Guy Callender, a British engineer who did some top secret war work, for his rest and relaxation, he decided to write all around the world and collect thermometer observations, temperature observations from weather stations, and put them all together to calculate a true global average temperature. And what he found in the 1930s was he could already see the increase in global temperature because of burning fossil fuels. And he wrote this paper where, I love it, he says something along the lines of, "You're not going to believe what I have to say, but in this paper I will show you through analyzing the data that we are already seeing the average temperature of the planet increase." In 1938. Isn't that amazing? So climate science is very old, and climate science is also very simple. Did you know that you can explain the basics of climate science with a cartoon in 60 seconds? Here we go. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun's energy shines down through this blanket almost like a window, and the Earth heats up, and then the Earth gives off heat energy. Just like a blanket keeps our body warm on a cold night, this blanket traps the heat energy given off by the Earth, keeping us, again, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. In fact, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice if it were not for this amazing natural feature. So what's the problem? The problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. And just like when I used to go stay at my grandma's house when I was little, and she would sneak in every night and put an extra blanket on me, and I would wake up sweating saying, "Grandma, I didn't need this blanket." In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need, and that's why it's running a fever. Does anybody really have a problem with nonlinear fluid dynamics? Does anybody really think that thermodynamics isn't real? Does anybody really think that the same science that explains how our stoves and our fridges and our airplanes work isn't real? No, nobody really thinks that. Okay, there may be one website somewhere. There always is one website somewhere. But nobody really has a problem with the basic science. And so when we say, as we said here, if they just had the facts, they'll change their mind, we've learned from the social science that may not be the case when an issue is already very politically polarized. In fact, I was on a dissertation committee of someone in media and communication where they were looking at people's responses to two science articles. One was something to do with astronomy that had no political implications whatsoever to anybody, and then one was about the science of climate change. And it was looking at how people were responding to them, to the facts, and as you can imagine, the results were very different. So the social science is very interesting because social science can study how we as humans interact with information. And back 5 years ago, Dan Kahan at Yale, whenever I show you a paper, I want to show you who did it, so you see their picture. Dan Kahan at Yale published a study where he said, public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. People don't know enough science. Now, here's what I love about the social science. We conducted a study to test this, and we found no support. In fact, people with the highest degree of science literacy were not most concerned, they were most polarized. And subsequent work that they have done have showed that the smarter we are in terms of our ability to do quantitative reasoning. So the better we are at quantitative reasoning, the better we are at justifying our pre-existing positions. Larry Hamilton, another sociologist at the University of New Hampshire, he looked at this a different way. He asked people, how sure are you that climate is changing due to human activities? Yes. And then he looked at people and asked them, do you consider yourself to be Democrat or Republican or Tea Party? And then how much education have you had? And the scale here, I'm sorry, it goes from 0 to 100, and it's obviously in white because you can't see it. It goes from 0 to 100, and as they get more education, depending on which political party they're affiliated with, they become more sure or they become less sure. So it isn't really a case that people have a problem with the basic science and that more facts will help. And when we engage with those types of things, we're engaging with the smokescreen. People want that to be us to think it's the problem, so we engage with arguing. We argue. It isn't a natural cycle. Let me explain natural cycles to you. It isn't volcanoes. Let me explain what happens when a volcano erupts to you. It isn't orbital cycles because according to those, the next ice age should be coming. We shouldn't be getting warmer. No, we scientists aren't in it for the money. In fact, I'd be making the exact same money in a different field with a whole lot less grief, right? But when we engage with these arguments, we're actually missing the real problem. What is the real problem? Well, you might say, I think I know what the real problem is. The real problem is that people aren't seeing it with their own eyes, right? If people actually saw it with their own eyes, they would change their minds. For example, if you live in Houston, you saw what Hurricane Harvey looked like. If you live in California, you've seen what the wildfires look like. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said when he spoke to the United Nations after his island was hit by a massive hurricane, he said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth we have just lived. But then Larry Hamilton did another study. Larry said, okay, in 2017, January in New Hampshire, and probably here too because it's not that far away, January in New Hampshire was very warm. It wasn't the warmest ever, but it was very warm. So this is average January temperature in New Hampshire, and you can see 2017 up there in the corner. So Larry said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask people in February if January was warm. So he was only asking people about their own state. He was asking them a number that their thermometers on their cars and in their backyard would have told them. He said, do you think January was warmer than average? If you look at the data, you can tell me, was January warmer than average? Yes. So he asked them, was January warmer than average? And then he asked them a seemingly unrelated question, who did you vote for in 2016? Isn't this crazy? So you might say a thermometer doesn't give you a different answer if you're Democrat or Republican, but apparently people think it does. The evidence of our own eyes is not enough to convince ourselves. So at this point, you may be feeling something like this. But you may think, okay, well, so if it isn't that more science education is the answer, if it isn't that more extreme events are the answer, now, of course, it does make a difference if it's more damaging. I think if you did the same study in Houston, you might find a slightly different answer, hopefully. But you may say, okay, Katharine, I know exactly what the problem is, and you should too, because you live in Texas. The problem is religion. In fact, you could make an entire presentation. I've gone through, and you can make a 45-minute presentation of all the quotes by political leaders linking religion to climate change in a negative way. For example, God is still up there. The arrogance of people to think we human beings could change what he is doing to the climate is outrageous. So we hear these religious-y sounding objections. God is in control. We have dominion over the earth. In the Bible, it said there will always be seasons. Of course, you know, now there will always be seasons. They'll just be warmer. Those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. And, of course, bring on the end times. So we think, okay, well, if that's the case, then let's get religious leaders to set them straight. And the Pope has certainly given it his best try, hasn't he? Yes. He convened a group of leaders from all over the world. They put 2 years of effort into producing an encyclical. The encyclical said many good things about climate change, connecting it to the economy, to impacts on the poor and the vulnerable, to inequity, to injustice, to food and water and health. And the Pope was not the only person to do it. Back in 2011, 7 years ago, the U.S. National Association of Evangelicals, believe it or not, they produced a report called Loving the Least of These that talked explicitly about the links between climate change and poverty. This is the summary. You can see the summary very carefully doesn't say the words climate and change in sequence. But if you open this up, it's got a whole chapter by Sir John Houghton, who you may know is a very famous and well-known climate scientist and former lead author of the IPCC. So they explicitly linked this issue. So no matter who you are, no matter what religious tradition you come from, we can find leaders of the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Evangelicals, Orthodox, obviously Catholic, the Pope. We can find these connections. But then if you look at surveys, and this is a survey that was done by the American Association of Religion, how concerned are you about climate change? Now it's really interesting because they looked at all Americans. So the top level there is all Americans. And of course, dark orange is very concerned, light orange is somewhat concerned, and then blue is somewhat unconcerned. Very unconcerned. Who's the most concerned people group in the entire United States about climate change? Hispanic Catholics. So you might say, well, of course they are, the Pope, right? Okay, hang on. Who's the least? Yeah, isn't that interesting? And then you might say, but the Pope, right? What is going on? Well, my colleague Ashley Landrum actually looked at this after the encyclical came out. She looked at the effect that the encyclical had on people. And what she found is that when people encounter new information, they interpret it through what? Through their filters. Through their filters of prior beliefs, social identity, what tribe we belong to, and messenger credibility. So it's not based solely on whether they think the information is accurate. It is based on the extent to which the message and the messenger are consistent with the values of your social group. Now you might still say, okay, but isn't Catholicism the primary social group, right? Well, what they found explicitly was, for people who already agreed with what the encyclical said, it improved their opinion of the Pope. They thought more highly of the Pope after the encyclical was published. So it wasn't a case of the Pope's reputation making them accept the encyclical, it was a case of the encyclical making them think better of the Pope. What happened if they didn't agree with the contents of the encyclical? It actually decreased their opinion of the Pope, even if they're Catholic. As they say in Texas, when you don't agree with somebody, but you feel like they mean well, you say, oh, bless their heart. So among a lot of churches in Texas and elsewhere, there's a lot of blessing the Pope's heart when it came to climate change. Isn't that ironic? So often we think about the whole, it's to do with the messenger. It's getting the trusted messenger. But what this showed was, it wasn't just the messenger, it was whether they agreed with the content or not. So we've been running a series of experiments now at evangelical colleges across the US and in Canada. And this paper was just put online this week. I'm really happy that it's open access, Environmental Research Letters, and it was, the first author is my dad. That is my father. And I'm not an author on this, I was the subject of this paper. So what they did was they took a video I made that talks about why climate change matters to us in the places where we live and what we can do about it. And we put in specific information to different locations, and they showed it to classes of undergraduate students in 3 universities or colleges. One in Texas, one in upstate New York, and one in Ontario. They also did a very extensive pre-testing of the students to see where they were politically and where they were theologically. What they found is that theologically the students were very similar across all 3 locations. Politically, there was a very strong gradient. The ones in Texas were most conservative. The ones in upstate New York were, kind of moderate. And then the ones in Canada were like, politics, what politics? What they did was they showed them these videos, and each video started and ended with a Christian framing to it. And then they edited out the Christian framing and they showed it without that. So there was 2 different studies in one. The first study was, does showing students these videos make a difference? They did a very long assessment before and after, and then they looked for significant differences before and after. And the answer was yes, it did make a difference. In fact, here's the fascinating thing. The students in Dallas started off the lowest in terms of how much they agreed with the science. And then the ones in upstate New York started off kind of in the middle, and the ones in Canada started off highest. Well, here's the first interesting thing. Everybody moved up to the same level. So they didn't have the same gains proportionally. The ones who were most conservative made the biggest gains. And then the ones who were kind of in the middle made the next, and the ones who were already kind of here made the smallest. Isn't that fascinating? So to me, that kind of said, this is why you're in Texas, because you can make the biggest difference. But in addition to anticipating global warming, of course. But the second result they found was really interesting, and that was the fact that, excuse me, when they removed the Christian framing, it didn't make a difference. So it wasn't the fact that they knew that I shared their beliefs or not, but what they speculated is, and this is what they're going to go on to study in the next study that they're doing, what they speculated was the fact that it was presented by an instructor at an institution who they assumed rightly they wouldn't be presented with this information if the institution and the instructor disagreed with it. So it was the context in which it was presented that was important, which is very hopeful, isn't it? Because it means that if you have a group where they trust what you or what the group leader says, then you can use material that doesn't necessarily have to be targeted to that specific audience, as long as there's a sense that, yes, we agree with it and we endorse it. So is the solution just to somehow, fix people's theological beliefs? It isn't, because, as John Evans found, he said, it's true that conservative Protestants, and I think he should now add conservative Catholics too, are more likely to disagree with the conclusiveness of climate science, but they found it isn't where you go to church that matters. It isn't where you sit for an hour on a weekend or a weekday that matters. The most important predictors, he found, of people's opinion are simply where we lie on the political spectrum, moderated by age and also even a bit by gender. Women are more likely to agree with the science than men, and younger people are much more likely to agree than older people. So what's going on here? What's going on is, as one of my colleagues from the National Association of Evangelicals says, he said, it's true that many evangelicals and many white Catholics oppose actions to slow climate change, but they don't do so on a religious basis. They do so politically, because they believe the government wants to take away their freedom. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to a group of water managers in South Texas. Many people think that when I talk to faith-based audiences that those are my toughest audiences. No, they are not. Because when you go talk to a Christian college to give a chapel service or a group, you're invited by the leader or the leadership team. So you are already implicitly or explicitly endorsed by them, and they are respected by the people there. Whereas when you go to speak to a group of producers or ag experts or water managers, you were invited by one person, and everybody else is giving that one person the side eye. Who invited the climate scientist? So that is by far the harder conversation to have. So I went and I spoke to these water managers, and I spent the first 15 minutes talking about El Nino and natural cycles and drought and flood, and then gradually easing into long-term trends and what we've already seen happening in the past and how we expect those to continue in the future, and then what we can start doing about water management and conservation. And at the end of the presentation, I will never forget, an older man stood up at the back of the room, and he was completely honest. He said, you know what? He said, everything you said actually makes sense. That was a really good compliment. But here's the problem. I don't want the government to set my thermostat. And I said, you're right, I don't want them to set my thermostat either. But that was his perception of the solutions. Remember Senator Inhofe? The one who said the arrogance of humans to think that we could. Well, the same year that he said that exact quote, the same year he was being interviewed by Rachel Maddow, and this is what he said, it is on the record. He said, do you realize I was actually on your side of this issue when I was first chairing that Senate Environment Committee, and I heard about this. I thought it must be true till when? Till I found out how much it would cost. People don't really have a problem with the science. They don't really have a problem with the theology. And when we think they do, just like Don Quixote, we're tilting with windmills. So how can we address this issue? We can address it by tackling the real myths that people really do believe. The myth that solutions pose an imminent threat. Like the man who said, the government's going to set my thermostat. Like the senator who says it would destroy the economy to fix climate change. Or people who believe it would mean returning to the Stone Age. Or, and this one's very important, do not underestimate it, the fact that many of the solutions seem profoundly un-American because what was the American Revolution fought over? Taxation and government control. What are the two things we hear about most often in climate solutions? Taxation and government control. And even worse, what if climate change leads to the mark, the beast, and the Antichrist? Yes, this is a real website. I did not make it up. In fact, I had many of these to choose from. This was just one. People do believe the solutions pose an imminent threat, and they also believe what? That the impacts don't. So now this makes sense, right? Why would you want to fix a problem if you don't think it really is a big problem, and if you think the solutions are going to be a big problem? Here's the proof that people don't think that the impacts are that bad. Now, these are a series of really interesting maps from the Yale public opinion polling. And they asked people, first of all, do you think global warming is happening? Anything that's orange is more than 50% of people saying yes. And pretty much everybody, except for a few counties in Utah, think yes. Global warming. Don't ask. I have no answer. Yes, global warming is happening. Do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Well, okay, now this is where it gets confusing. Even the counties in Utah who don't think it's happening think it will harm plants and animals. Do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. Do you think it will harm people in developing countries? Pretty much yes. We're starting to see a little bit of blue, but mostly yes. Now the rubber's going to hit the road. Ready? Do you think global warming is already or will, in the next 10 years, harm people in the United States? And there's one more. Do you think global warming, not is, but will, do you think it will affect you personally? No matter what we think about climate change, we don't think it will affect us personally, except for who lives in those orange counties. You know the answer to that now? Who lives in the orange counties? Hispanic Catholics, exactly. Exactly. That's because when we think about climate change, what's the number one image that people want to put on the cover of every book about climate change? Exactly. This is the number one image they want to pick. Or if we think about people, there are always pictures of people who live far away. So that's why when I wrote an article for Foreign Policy last summer, I absolutely loved the cover picture they picked. The cover picture they picked was of an iceberg floating in the ocean, but who's on the iceberg? People. We care about a changing climate because we are not prepared for it. Our population has soared to almost 7.5 billion people. We have trillions of dollars of infrastructure that is built for conditions of the past. We have hundreds of millions of people who live along the coasts. This is what our coastal cities looked like in the 1950s, and this is what they looked like 5 years ago. We are already seeing extreme weather events that cause billions of dollars of damage. This is the count of how many climate and weather events there have been in each state that have cost at least $1 billion worth of damage. Hurricane Harvey cost about $125 billion. Texas is number one. Texas has had 105. That's 44% of the total events. But wherever we live, and you can see Pennsylvania is pretty dark too, wherever we live, we experience naturally occurring climate and weather disasters. But we care about a changing climate because it exacerbates them. It's loading the dice against us. It's making our heavy rainfall more intense. It's making our heat waves stronger and more frequent, although it is helping with some of our cold waves. Our droughts where I live in South Texas are getting stronger. Forest fires are burning greater area. And then, of course, there's hurricanes. Their rainfall rate is increasing. They're getting bigger. They're intensifying faster. They're moving more slowly. They're not getting more frequent. They are not. But they absolutely are changing in response to a changing climate. Wherever we live, Whether we live in Southeast Asia, whether we live along the Gulf Coast, whether we live in California or the Northeast, we are already at risk from naturally occurring weather and climate disasters that are just part of life. And the number one reason why we care as humans is because climate change is loading those weather dice against us. It took Hurricane Harvey, which could have easily happened 100 years ago. But if Hurricane Harvey had happened 100 years ago, there would have been about 40% less rainfall associated with it. The California wildfires. California's always had wildfire, but they're burning much greater area, and there's more people, and there's much more infrastructure at risk. So the risks are increasing, not just due to climate change, they're increasing because we are increasing too. We have more people, we're more vulnerable, we have more at risk. So when we look at Pennsylvania, we know that changes are happening here too. We did this study 10 years ago. It's being updated, and there's also some really cool fact sheets that you can get right here from the university if you haven't seen them already. Here at the university, you can find the fact sheets right here. If you just Google climate impacts in PA, you'll see this website pop up and you can get the fact sheets. But we know that things are changing here. We know that summer temperatures are increasing, and depending on if we follow a higher or lower scenario, they will increase more or they will increase less. We know that right here in State College, our extreme heat days are going to be going up. If we follow a lower scenario, that's the yellow bar, or a higher scenario, that's the red bar, there is a big difference between those two scenarios, and that's the difference our choices make. But we are going to see some pretty significant changes. I mean, that's a big increase in number of days over 90 degrees. And then we also looked at where we split the state in half, not for political reasons, just for scientific reasons. We split the state in half, and we looked at where the state would essentially migrate to in the summer as a function of the heat index. So not just average summer temperature, but humidity too, because that's how hot it feels, right? So in terms of the heat index, the yellow is the lower scenario, the red is the higher scenario, and this shows us not just what we have to prepare for, but it also shows us what we can avoid by making smart choices, right? I mean, there is a big difference between Alabama and Kentucky in the summer. Yes, yes there is. Or between Maryland versus Georgia in the summer. We care about climate change because it affects us in the places where we live, and these fact sheets that you can get right here at the university walk through all the different changes that we're going to see here. It isn't just about us, though. If we look around the world, the people who are most vulnerable, the people who live in the poorest areas of the world. So the second reason we care isn't just because it affects us, it's because it affects people who have done the least to contribute to the problem. So the last question then is this: what can we do about this, right? What can we do about it? I mean, it's this huge global problem. I'm one person. The US seems to be making one bad decision after another. How can we turn this thing around? I am going to tell you the most important thing you can do about climate change. And you may be surprised because it has nothing to do with light bulbs. Although that's good, nothing wrong with light bulbs, changing them, I mean, to be clear. The single most important thing we can do about climate change is talk about it. Because hardly anybody in the US even hears somebody else talk about it. Why is talking important? Because why would we care? Why would we think it mattered if nobody ever talks about it? Why would we think we can fix it if nobody ever talks about it? Why would we vote about it if nobody talks about it? Why would our politicians think that we want change at the city, at the state, at the national level if we don't talk about it? I really truly believe that fixing this thing starts with talking about it. Having conversations. And having conversations that don't get into all the details about the science and natural cycles and volcanoes. If you want those details, they're there, they're available. We have global weirding episodes on them. But the most important thing to do is to start off with what we have in common, with what we share. And what more do we share than the fact that we live here together? We want the state to be healthy, to have a healthy economy, to be a safe place to live, to grow our family. We can explain why it matters to us. But we have to end with inspiring people to act. And we do that by sharing our hope of what's happening. So what does this look like? Well, it looks like, just kind of walking through, you know what? Things are changing, and it's affecting some essential characteristics of the Northeast. It affects our fall colors. It affects the security of coastal cities. I know they're not exactly in Pennsylvania, but they're around here. It affects small rural economies that depend on snowmobiling or dairy farming. It affects things that are important to us. And there are positive solutions. What type of solutions? We can talk about things that we're doing ourselves. Sure, we can talk about light bulbs. I had a great conversation with the guy who was helping me change some of my light bulbs. He didn't know how much money you'd save by changing the light bulb. So I was like reading to him off the box. This light bulb will save you $30. He's like, oh, how much did it cost? I said, well, it cost about $3. He's like, oh, I'm gonna get some of those too. Where'd you get them? So I texted him the Amazon link. And we could have a conversation about saving energy. And this is a guy who probably had never really talked about climate change before. We can talk about cool new technology like solar roofs. We can talk about simple things like eating lower down the food chain. We can talk about what the university is doing. And you should know this. I've had lots of great conversations about the fact that Penn State is reducing its greenhouse gas emissions 35% by 2050, 85% by 2025, 85% by 2050. There's a great plan to provide solar-generated energy for the university. The coal-fired power plant is already off, right? They're running natural gas. You can talk about what the state is doing. This is a map from a website called CakeX. And every little dot there is a dot of an adaptation program that's going on. If you click on each one, it will pop up and it will give you the title of what's happening. I like to talk about what Texas is doing. The fact that Texas has more wind energy than any state in the country. We're already up over 20%, and they're putting in 2 new solar farms and a wind farm right close to where we live. The biggest Army base in the US is in Texas, and they are already 100% clean energy because they're saving $150 million of taxpayer money. We have one of the first towns in the country to go 100% renewable because 3 business students crunched the numbers and told them how much money they'd save. I like having conversations about what churches are doing. Yeah. It's great to have conversations about what agriculture is doing. Feeding cows seaweed to reduce their methane emissions. Looking at sustainable grazing practices that put carbon back in the soil. Looking at how agroforestry in Tajikistan or in Ghana can put carbon back in the soil where it's like Miracle-Gro on steroids for poor and minimal soils, and putting it where we want it rather than where we don't want it up in the atmosphere. I love talking about the fact that, United's already flying flights on biofuel out of Los Angeles. And at the Oslo airport, they will fuel any airplane with biofuel that you can grow from algae or from agricultural waste. In Chicago, they're putting green roofs on buildings to reduce the urban heat island effect. In Minnesota, they're putting pollinator-friendly plants and solar farms to attract and to house bees. Win-win. Businesses are picking up on this. The richest corporation in the world is Walmart. And they're going 50% clean energy by 2025. Apple's number 11. They're already at 100% and they're decarbonizing their supply chain. The biggest solar farm in the entire world is in Morocco. The biggest offshore wind farm in the world is in the United Kingdom. The most wind and solar energy anywhere in the world is in China. Did you know that? A few people did. Pay-as-you-go solar, where you can actually dial in on your cell phone how much you're going to pay for, is revolutionizing sub-Saharan Africa where people don't have electricity. Project Drawdown, which was the topic of last year's lecture and is going to be the subject of a conference next September, has amazing solutions. If you feel like you don't have anything to talk about, just go to Project Drawdown's website and start looking at their list. What's the 3rd most important thing we can do about climate change? Reduce food waste. Have a great conversation about reducing food waste. Most people would be okay with talking about reducing food waste, right? What about number 6? Educating women and girls in developing countries. Let's have a good discussion about helping people go to school, stay in school, raise the quality, the economic viability of their family, reduce infant mortality. Let's talk about forests, regenerative agriculture, reducing refrigerant leaks. Let's talk about the fact that 40% of people, cities, states, businesses, tribal nations, universities, 40% of US carbon emissions are still in on the Paris Agreement. That's pretty encouraging, isn't it? There's a lot of positive things we can talk about, and what do they give us? They give us the single most important thing we need to fix this. The most important thing we need to fix climate change is hope. Because without hope, we won't make it. Without hope, it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need that hope to sustain our long-term action. And what will lead us to that hope? What will lead us to that hope is constructive conversations where we identify the values that we share, we connect on why this matters to us personally, and we can find ways that we can work together to act. Because, in the words of one of my favorite scientists, it's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. Thank you.
So we have people come to the mics to either side, and thank you so much, Katharine. Inspiring.
How does the carbon fee and dividend idea fit with the way to deal with people and converting them?
So what I often like to do, I say in terms of solutions, I'm solution agnostic in that I want whatever people are happy with that works. But what people are often happiest with is a solution that's pretty bipartisan, pretty in the middle. And so that's one of the reasons why I like the idea personally, not as a scientist, just as a human. I like the idea of putting a price on carbon and giving that money back to people. So in other words, if I reduce the carbon I use, I get money back. And that's the idea behind many different proposals for carbon prices, carbon taxes, and carbon fee and dividend that Citizens Climate Lobby looks at. And one of the reasons why I think this is a potentially good idea is because in the province of British Columbia in Canada, they've had it for 10 years already. They've had it for 10 years, and it has reduced personal income tax to the lowest in Canada. It's reduced corporate income tax to one of the lowest in all of North America, and that's really saying something. And when they asked people, do you like it? Most people did. It's reduced carbon emissions, and they also grew the economy at the same time. So there's no perfect solution to climate change. That's what politics is for, to hammer that out. We absolutely should be having a debate over solutions. But the debate should not be over the number that a thermometer is giving us. The debate should be over, yes, we agree, it is real, it is serious, the impacts are already becoming dangerous. What can we do to reduce carbon as quickly as possible? Let's figure out the solution that works for the most people. Thank you. All right. Anybody, you can go ahead and text your question if you have one.
So I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
You encourage us to have conversations.
Yeah.
You've had a lot of very interesting ones in this area.
Yes.
Can you tell us one of those that really was a surprise and how it turned out?
Yes, I have absolutely had some really interesting conversations. Let's see. Okay, so one conversation that I've had is I went to speak at a conference in the UK. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm in the UK. Clearly nobody here. It was a professional conference to scientists from a broad range of fields, not just climate scientists. But I thought, we're in the UK. Surely there's nobody here who has a problem with the science. So I didn't spend any time talking about how we know that climate is changing, how we know it really is humans, it's not natural cycles or the sun or volcanoes. I just went straight into what the impacts are and what the cutting edge of the science is and why we care about it and what we need to do about it. So then afterwards they had a tea break, which is normally quite civilized, and this tea break was not, because there was somebody who had a big problem with what I had to say. He was an engineering professor from a different university, and he was not happy. It was about, how could you be so arrogant as to say that you're certain about this? There's so much uncertainty, nobody can ever say why this is happening. How can we be irresponsible and tell people it's humans when it could be something we don't know about? And there's research that actually has looked at that. But it was not a good conversation. It did not end well because he wasn't even really going to listen to what I had to say. So that wasn't the conversation that was so positive. 2 years later, this was in the UK, right? 2 years later, I was at home in Toronto, and my dad was presenting a paper at a conference at McMaster University, which was an hour away, and he said, well, why don't you just come with me for the day? So I said, sure, that'd be fine, I'll come with you. So I came with him, I went to his presentation, we had lunch. I walked out of the lunch hall, and this was in the summer on a university campus. I walked out, and the door locked behind me. You ever had that experience before? I looked around, my phone was dead, I didn't know where I was on campus, I couldn't find my way back to the hall, I didn't know what to do. So I'm standing there hoping that somebody else is stupid enough to walk out the wrong door too. And sure enough, somebody walks through the door, it slams behind them, locked too, and I look at this, it's that guy. It's the guy from England from 2 years ago. I was just like, what are the chances? So I looked at him, I took a deep breath. He looked at me, he took a deep breath too. And we both kind of decided, we're going to make the best of this. So I said, do you know where you're going? Oh, I'm not sure, but well, let's walk, try walking this way. So we're walking along, and he's obviously looking for a neutral topic of conversation. So he looked down at my bag, and he happened to see that I had knitting needles sticking out of my bag. I like to knit at conferences. It helps me pay attention. It was my mother's birthday next week, so I was making her a scarf. So he said, oh, you knit? And I said, yes, I'm making my mother a birthday present. He said, oh, I knit too. I said, really? And he said, yes, I knit my whole family presents for Christmas last year. I said, wow, that's fantastic. He said, yeah, because I think that we buy too much stuff. If we really care about people, we should make something for them rather than buying some, plastic crap from China. And I was like, I completely agree. And then he sort of warmed to his thing. He's like, well, we live in a small apartment near the city center, so we don't have to own a car. I only make one international trip a year, and this was it. I was like, oh, this was it. We actually made our furniture from packing crates. I don't just recycle, I upcycle. And so he went through and he described this incredible low-carbon, minimalist life that was fueled by all the same principles that I've shared, but I wasn't living to the same extent. And when we got to where we were going, I turned to him, I said, you know what? I wish that everybody thought the same thing that you do about climate change, but I wish that everybody lived like you. Because if we did, we wouldn't have this problem. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, really. So it was one of the most interesting conversations I've had.
Fantastic story. Well, people were slow to figure out how to text, but they have. So,
yes, you got it. Okay.
So maybe for the audience that's not in the room right now, I'll read them so they can hear them, and then you can respond.
Yeah, we'll go for it. Pick one.
I'll start at the top. What is your response to those who claim that it's not affordable to make changes to renewable energy?
Yes. To those, I would say it used to be the case. It absolutely did. And it still is these days as individuals often when we're looking for a clean power company, especially in this part of the world. Where I live in Texas, though, wind and solar is actually now cheaper than natural gas, if you can believe it. In fact, there's a couple of natural gas plants that are in serious economic trouble because they haven't got the money back yet from building the plant, and they're already being undersold by wind and solar. The reason why solar is the fastest growing type of energy in the world right now, not in North America, but across the whole world, is because it's coming in at the lowest prices, including storage. So to people who say, well, I personally can't make a choice today, I would say, I understand. Here, Green Mountain Energy costs more than coal-fired energy in Pennsylvania, and that's true. And if that's not in your budget, I totally understand, and there is no judgment at all. Because we all make decisions for a variety of reasons, and we can only do what we can afford. But I would want to share with them some really cool, exciting stories, like what's happening in Texas, like the fact that the Museum of Coal Mining in Kentucky put solar panels on the roof, like the fact that there's way times more jobs in the solar energy industry across the whole US than in all the fossil fuel powered electricity production. The idea that there's, a Chinese wind company went into Wyoming to retrain coal miners to do wind energy installations if they wanted to. I would tell them some of the stories to show how the world is changing. And though it might not be available to me right here, right now, things are changing really quickly. And in many places, including Maryland, you can get solar panels put on your roof with a loan, where the loan is calibrated to be equal to your average power bill every month. So you have zero net investment, you pay the same amount every month, but you're actually just getting solar instead of the grid. And one of my colleagues did that in Maryland, and every time I see him now, he pulls up his computer, he's like, let me show you my stats. He just loves it, it's so addictive. The producer of our Global Weirding series did that himself, and he actually found a credit union that would give him a lower monthly rate than his power bill. They cut it by about 10 to 15%, and they have a young family, they pinch every penny, so they're saving money on it. So you'd be surprised on some of the options that there are. If you can't make them now, that's totally fine, but the world is changing, and just knowing that, I think, really helps. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I can answer question 2, which is, can you provide the link for the recording of this presentation? And yes, we will. And we'll send it out to everybody who signed up and registered for this event. And those of you who did got multiple messages about the change, so you know that. But if you didn't sign up or you're not sure, make sure you talk to either Kevin or Chris in the back on your way out, and we'll get it to you.
Perfect. And I'll also post on social media, on my Facebook and on my Twitter pages.
So I'm going to combine a couple of them here.
Yeah.
So how do you start a conversation with friends and keep it positive, not depressive, and go beyond emotions and feelings, or maybe use them to talk about climate change and solutions?
Yeah. Also, I would just like to say that next one is very funny. Good one. Yeah. So in all seriousness, though, what gives you hope is the biggest and most frequent question I get these days. Because as a scientist, when I look at the science, that doesn't give me hope. It seems like every new scientific study that's coming out is showing this happening either faster or to a greater extent or in a bigger way than we thought. I don't get hope from the science. But where I do get hope from is by actively seeking, and this is really important, it requires actively seeking the good news. Because we are bombarded with bad news all the time. If you just look at the news, if you just went to Google or to some website for news and you looked at it, just read down the headlines. Negative, 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 negative. The horrible thing that happened, the terrible thing somebody said, the awful thing that somebody did, it's negative. To find hope, we have to go look for it, and the hopeful stories are out there. They might be small, they might be fine print, they might be something you hear from somebody, something you see. If you follow my Facebook page, for example, I try to post a lot of hopeful stories, but the hope is out there. It's out there in terms of what people are doing, what organizations are doing, what businesses are doing, what churches are doing, what tribal nations are doing, what's happening on the other side of the world, what's happening right here at home, right here at the university. We have to go out and look for the hope because the emotions that we feel are a product of the input. And if we are just constantly being bombarded with negative input, of course we're going to feel depressed. And believe me, I have my days. I can't not. But hope is what's going to take us through. And so not only do we need hope, we have this responsibility, I think, to actually look for and help others learn about hope. Another thing that I think is really hopeful is to connect with people who are like-minded. Join an organization that can help you amplify your voice where you're surrounded by people who share the same values. Organizations exist of every type. There's organizations for skiers called Protect Our Winters. There's organizations for birders. The Audubon Society talks about this all the time. There's political organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby where you can be from any part of the spectrum. It's all about working together to fix this problem. There's libertarian organizations, there's evangelical organizations, there's the Climate Catholic Covenant, there's Interfaith Power and Light. There's all types of different organizations. There's ones for people from a military background, there's ones for people who hunt and fish. Look, actively search for hope, and when we have the conversation, as I think you've seen me model, talk about what gives us hope. Talk about what the university is doing, what the state is doing, what you heard is happening in Morocco, in China, in Texas. Have that conversation that ends on a hopeful note and talk about concrete things that we can do ourselves. Because the most effective way that we can reduce our collective impact, and this is the next question, is by talking about it. And then the most effective thing that we as individuals can do is step on the carbon scales, a carbon calculator, step on the carbon scales, measure your carbon footprint. I always get my students to do this and I say, is it what you expected? And they're always surprised by where the different places are that the carbon emissions come from. Make some smart choices to reduce your carbon footprint and then talk about it. I think the number one impact that I've had from reducing my carbon footprint is not totally what I've done, but rather talking about it. I mean, simple stuff like our house has an extra alcove for an extra fridge. I decided not to put an extra fridge in there because it costs money, it creates demand for more electricity. And so what did I use that alcove for? Well, my laundry room wasn't very big, so I got my husband, kind man, to install a bunch of racks for me so now I could dry my clothes. Win-win. Less use of the dryer, no extra fridge, good use of space. Lots of good questions. Let me answer number 2. Any advice for talking about climate change at the Thanksgiving table? Yes. We in fact, we in fact have a global weirding video just for you. Yes. So if you go to Global Weirding on YouTube, here it is. Our second most popular episode, the first most popular episode, fascinatingly, is The Bible Doesn't Talk About Climate Change, Does It? That's our most watched episode. The second one is, if I just explain the facts to Uncle Joe, he'll get it, right? And so that's the one for you for Thanksgiving dinner. Watch that second one right there. All right, over to you, Tom.
So you sort of covered this before, but I'll just come back to it because there's many of these questions. So, how do you start those conversations? How do you get beyond emotions and feelings? How do you keep it positive and not negative? And how do you do it when you're surrounded by like-minded folks who already agree?
Yes. Yes. Well, I would encourage you to look for communities of people who share a core value of yours. So the important place to start these conversations with is a genuinely shared value. But even if they agree with the science, remember the map I showed? People agree with the science, but they don't think it matters to them. So have conversations about how it matters to us and what we can do about it, because the percentage of people who are actually active on this is only about 10% of the population. Well, if you live in that 10% bubble, lucky you in some ways, but try to get a little outside your bubble. Find people who share your values still, who you can genuinely connect with. I'm not asking you to go connect with people who you can't connect with, because what's the point of that? But find people who you do connect with, and start the conversation with what you share, connect the dots to a changing climate, and then talk about things that you can do to work together to fix this thing.
Your husband is a pastor. Can you share with us how he understands climate change in his faith and how he addresses it in his congregation?
Yes. Well, so the answer to that is partly in our most popular episode here. So I would encourage you to watch that, and I'm not going to reinvent the wheel and go over that. But what I would say is this. 99.9% of us, possibly even more, already have every single value we need to care about a changing climate. Just think about that for a minute. Let it sink in. And you might say, but what about, well, what do Christians believe? Christians believe that we have responsibility over every living thing on this planet. Christians believe that we're to love and care for those who are less fortunate than us. And these are actually core values that are shared with just about every major world religion in the world. So we are the very people that care about a changing climate. What if we're hunters or fishers and we care about having a healthy ecosystem and healthy populations? We're the very people that care about a changing climate. What if we care very much about national security and we come from a military background? Well, the military calls climate change a threat multiplier. We are the exact right person to care about a changing climate. What if we're economically and fiscally conservative? We want to save money. Well, the way of the future, saving money, is clean energy. We're the exact person to be promoting a clean energy economy with long-term sustainable jobs, even here in coal country. So whoever we are, take the time to get to know people and figure out what makes them tick, because 99.9% of us are the very person to care about a changing climate. We just haven't connected the dots.
So you're going to have to pull up the screens because I think there's one or two questions I can't see. But as I'm looking at those, I wanted to just ask you, so you're a Canadian?
Oh, yes.
Most of us are not. You've observed this for many years.
I have.
Why are we like we are?
Well, this is a really interesting one because American attitudes are starting to leak across the border. When you look at Canadians, in the US, the number one predictor of whether we agree climate is changing and humans are responsible is simply where we fall on the political spectrum. When you look at Canadians, we're beginning to move in that direction, I'm very sorry to say. But it's not as strong and it's not as polarized, and part of the reason is, in Canada, we have multiple political parties. So it's not just one or two, either or. And then the other issue is in Canada, actually there's several, so multiple political parties, we don't take up politics as part of our identity. So it's very rare, it's not unheard of, but it's rare in Canada for somebody to introduce themselves and to say, I am a blank. Whereas in the US, it's very common to have somebody say, I am a blank as part of their identity. The third difference in Canada is that we didn't fight a revolutionary war to free ourselves from government control and unfair taxation. So we don't have that inherent cultural, ideological revolt against the government telling me what to do. It just isn't part of our psyche. Do not underestimate that. And when you look at national characteristics and you look at which countries are the most independent in the world versus being, hierarchical or communal in their national character, the United States is the most independent country in the world, which means, you don't like somebody else telling you what to do. And the second most independent country in the world is Australia. And if you know anything about politics in Australia and climate change, it is the number 2 most contentious country in the world. So there's a very strong correlation between national identity, national values, the political system, and how we react to climate change, which is essentially a tragedy of the commons, which requires collective action to fix it. So it's amazing how we can be so close together, Canada and the US, on many things, yet we can be so different on our fundamental perspectives and values. And it is an absolutely fascinating conversation and discussion, because in Canada, you get many more people saying, sure, climate change is real, but does that translate into it affects me? Most people in Canada think it would be great. Warmer winters, less snow plows. So we really, when it actually comes down to it, we do have the same problem. We don't think it matters to us, but we express it very differently. We want to be good citizens. We want to help poor countries. We're aware that it's disproportionately affecting poor countries, but we don't see why we should be penalized to help other people that we don't know and will never see. That's kind of more the perspective in Canada.
So we're going to close up in a minute or two, but there are a few more questions here, and actually you can read them quicker than I, so I'll let you just pick what order you want to take them in, but I think,
Okay.
a whole 10 minutes.
I love the comments too. Thank you for that. If you're interested in more science, let me actually point you to questions about the thermohaline circulation and tipping points and surprises and things. Let me point you to the National Climate Assessment. This is volume 1 about the science, and the most interesting chapter, in my opinion, is the one that I helped write, which is chapter 15. Chapter 15 is called Potential Surprises. So if you're interested in not just what we know, but what we don't know, read chapter 15. It's all about what we don't know. And let me tell you, read chapter 15 and then make sure that you're going to have a good night's sleep afterwards, because you're going to need it. It's not going to give you any hope. If you're concerned about lack of hope, do not even read it. But if you want to know what we're facing, I think it lays it out pretty clearly. And then go read something really positive afterwards. Okay? Yes. Following the money is a really interesting question. So my favorite Global Weirding episode, personally, is the one we did about kids. If I'm just one kid, what can I do? And there's, if you want hope. Okay, so if you want hope, let me see if I can find we have almost 30 episodes now, which is amazing. So the funniest one, in my opinion, is this one. Climate change is just a money grab by scientists, and that's me with my silver platter with all my government grant dollars that I'm about to take into my secret Dr. Evil lair. Just kidding, in case anybody was wondering. But then the most hopeful one, so the one that you can watch if you need that shot of hope in the arm, is I'm just one kid, I can't do anything about climate change. And the answer is, kids are putting us to shame. They are growing algae biofuel under their beds and winning science fairs with it. They are collecting used cooking oil from around the town and actually setting up a gas station to sell it. They are creating, $5 devices that make electricity out of wind and solar energy. They are leading lawsuits against the federal government to secure their future. What kids are doing is amazing, and if you want a shot of hope, the #1 episode I would recommend is I'm Just One Kid, What Can I Do? So thank you so much. Thank you again for coming out on the snowy cold night.